to move to our next panel. And this panel is super relevant right now because a lot of us, when we're in aerospace, we stay in a box with it. Well, I work in manufacturing, or I work in jet engines, or I work in this. And you know what? There is so much out there, so much. So the women that are going to speak on our next panel are pretty fabulous. And they've worked in all kinds of companies, from GE to NASA, just the whole shebang. And so they're going to talk to you about what it's like to transition your aerospace career, to go try something new, to move to a type of company you haven't necessarily thought about. Right now, we are in a time of challenge, but not all of the industry is hurting. Not all of it's hurting. Aerospace, commercial aerospace is really hurting, but there are some bright spots. And 28 of the companies that are registered today are actually hiring. And we're going to share that information with you. In fact, if you are hiring, get posting the links to the jobs in the chat bar. Anyway, I could talk forever. I'm going to have to calm down, go lie down for a bit. So I'm going to introduce Emily Wittman. Emily is the CEO of AFA. And she actually comes from a political background. And so I've loved to get to know Emily as she's moved from politics into the Aerospace Futures Alliance. And some of the stuff that she's working on, I think could create more opportunities for all of us in the future. So welcome, Emily.
Good morning. Doing the typical check. Everyone can hear me, right?
Oh, we can hear you.
Awesome. Good. Thank you. Well, what a panel to follow, honestly, although I'm very confident that our panelists this morning will be able to knock that one out of the park as well. This is such a critical topic. As Fiona mentioned, I started in politics and didn't know the difference between composite, aluminum, tail wing, fuselage. What I love about our industry is that there's so much information out there and it's so easy to learn and become passionate about it. So I'll walk you through my transition. And that's the topic of today's panel now, is expanding horizons, transitioning your skills across the aerospace ecosystem. And again, like I said, our panel is just amazing. So we're going to go ahead and get started because I know we are running a little bit long and our discussion is going to be great. So I'm going to go ahead. Joanna, I don't know if we're able to put up our slides here, starting with mine to the group. Where did Fiona go?
I'm here.
Fiona, do we have our slides for the group?
We do. I'm looking over at my husband now.
Great.
With kind eyes.
Great.
So we're gonna open those now.
Perfect. So what I'm going to have the group share today is what looks like a linear transition period in our careers, a very long, even line. What really comes with a lot of twists and turns and interesting debates, internal debates about your professional trajectory and how that has been influenced by your personal trajectory. Starting with mine. So if we can go up to the one that says Emily Wittman, it should be the first slide there. Perfect. You're getting a preview of everyone else. Great. So our panelists today, starting with me, are going to walk you through our personal transitions and then really identify a key pivot point in our timelines that was full of challenge or a particular turn where we really had to think about what was next for us and how we were going to use the skills we built over time to achieve that. So I'll walk you through mine. And I don't know if anyone else started their morning with the daily podcast today from the New York Times, but they were talking about the refugee crisis and reminding us about the refugee crisis that has been sort of overlooked during this COVID time. And I mentioned that because when I got out of college at the University of Washington in 2013, I was fully convinced that I was going to work in international refugee policy. I had interned with the International Rescue Committee down in SeaTac doing refugee resettlement work for about a year, helping folks from all around the world who'd been displaced find a home and find resources to really create their own American dream for themselves in our area. And the first pivot point for me that was really critical, because you'll see, well, if I did refugee policy, how in the world did I get into aerospace, is I went to work for United States Senator Maria Cantwell, and I wanted to do immigration policy in her office, but that position was filled by an expert in the field. And so I ended up doing federal grant work and helping communities here in Washington locate federal resources to do catalytic job creation programs. And a lot of that, just by nature of our economy here in Washington, was based on aerospace, based on workforce, and based on advanced manufacturing. So there's this first pivot point where I wanted to do refugee policy and ended up getting really passionate about the major industry that creates jobs and opportunities for Washingtonians, and that was aerospace. So after that, I went to Puget Sound Regional Council, which is a metropolitan planning organization in the area covering Snohomish, King, Pierce, and Kitsap counties. The hub and the center of our global aerospace strength in the world is in those 4 counties. I did economic policy work for them, focusing on the 5-year economic plan. And again, aerospace played a critical role. But the real pivot point for me in this timeline was this work as the council lead for the governor's new mid-market airplane council. And I mentioned that because I saw an opportunity where I went to the first meeting, and it was a coalition, as I think we build in Washington State quite a bit, of 30 to 40 community stakeholders, very passionate, high-level executives brought into the room to discuss how we were going to land this new airplane by the Boeing company. And I looked around and I saw a whole lot of captains and not a lot of crew able to help with this work. And so I developed a strategy and walked into the then Commerce Director of Washington State and said, what do you think about me staffing this group and helping you organize this? And he looked at me and said, well, have you already talked to so-and-so about the communications plan, which told me they really needed help and they were already hitting the ground running. And so I started right then and really got into the aerospace ecosystem and the key issues. And then my timeline has been pretty straight up until the role I have now, which I'm now a year in, which feels crazy, as the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Aerospace Futures Alliance. So I will pause there and just highlight that critical pivot point for me was really taking a risk that I did not feel qualified for in my resume on paper. And we'll return to that theme in a minute, but I am going to call up our next person, which is Hillary King. So Hillary, over to you to share your trajectory. And again, what is that key pivot point in your timeline that we really want to focus on?
All right, thanks, Emily, and good morning, and good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm, just going to say my grateful point right now is being among such an incredibly diverse and impactful group of women. I'd say for the first time in my entire 30-plus year career to have been in a company of these many really powerful women in aerospace. So this is just tremendous. So I'm not going to walk you through this because honestly, when it's on paper like this and I see it, I feel a little bit embarrassed because it looks like I have commitment issues. But that's not really the case. I choose to think of myself as a curious learner, and perhaps I get bored a little bit easy, but I'm just always looking for the next thing. And while some of my transitions have been, I'll say, parking lots for me based on personal choices that I've had to make at the time, and something that we always want to emphasize, your career is a journey. It's not always just the next thing that's promoting you. Sometimes there are really great and valid, important personal reasons that you need to take a step off center stage and do something different. But what I will say that even in those moments that I didn't feel I was progressing professionally, I learned amazing things that then became springboards to the next thing. At the time, I didn't know it, but in retrospect, they certainly allowed me to get to the place where I am today for different reasons than I expected. But what I will say about, probably the most pivotal thing for me was really early in my career. I was 28 years old. I had just transitioned from, I'd say, a really true engineering position into a field support and applications engineering position. So the first thing that did for me is I got completely bitten by the bug of aviation, not just aerospace, because honestly, if I hadn't made this change, I doubt that I would have stayed in the aerospace business, because what I learned amongst many things through this transition is I'm not a really good engineer. I'm really much better at broader concepts and strategy and business and customer-facing things, and I'm good at problem solving, which is probably the best thing my engineering degree afforded me, but I'm not a good engineer. So when I made this transition, part of it was moving to Germany. And this is one of those moments where, you know, if it's not a definite yes, then it needs to be a no. But this was such a definite yes. My boss asked me if I was willing to take a field support position in Hamburg, Germany, supporting Lufthansa Airlines at their tech ops base in Hamburg. And for those of you that are familiar with Lufthansa, for anybody in a technical role, that had to be really intimidating. And for me, as a very young 28-year-old female early career, that was mind-bogglingly frightening. But I did it anyway. Never had been really realistically out of the United States of America, other than a very simple vacations to Caribbean islands, which were lovely, but certainly didn't prepare me for the cultural change that I experienced. Did not speak the language. Did not really know how to acclimate to the weather coming from Phoenix to really rainy Hamburg. So there's a lot of personal challenges there, but from a professional perspective, I learned about airline operations and found out how much I loved the complexity of airlines. I learned business because although I was the tech rep there, I was also responsible for managing a book of business with those airlines, whether it was their aftermarket support, warranty claims, us trying to sell products onto the airplane that were aftermarket type products, STCs, et cetera. But I think most importantly for me, both personally and professionally, was cultural growth and really understanding the value of diverse ways of thinking, diversity of people. And that's propelled me in so many different directions that I can't even describe at this point. But I think I'll end with that because we're going to get into some other details later.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Afternoon, good evening. My name is Shalmi Jayaraja. I'm a manager in the Aerospace and Defense Management Consulting practice at Accenture. It's awesome to be here with such amazing company. I'm humbled. My start to aerospace, actually, I've always been a huge fan of aerospace since the time I was a kid. I was fascinated by planes and space and aviation. And so I studied aerospace engineering at the University of Southern California. And I spent about half of my career so far in engineering roles and about the second half in strategy, business development, and consulting roles. And so, the most obvious pivot point in my career was probably about halfway through when I completed my MBA and I transitioned from engineering to internal consulting and strategy roles, companies like British Petroleum and Boeing. But perhaps, the earliest pivot point where I realized that I had an interest in business and working with companies at an international scale and across ecosystems was earlier, in between the time that I spent at JPL at the Jet Propulsion Lab and Airbus. So coming out of school, I think I wanted to be a huitran. I wanted to be a rocket scientist. I came from parents that were 2 PhD immigrants. And so, it was a lot about education and achievement. And, a couple years into working at JPL, I was in my dream job, but I also felt I was unsure if I wanted to pursue a PhD. And so one of the pivots that I took at that point was to actually, like Hillary, take an opportunity in Germany. I did a US Department of State scholarship program called Congress Bundestag Youth Exchange. And I spent a year in Germany at the age of 25, working at Airbus and studying at the University of Stuttgart and learning German. And it was at that point where, I was in a similar role to what I did in the US in spacecraft thermal engineering, but I started to realize that I really loved international business. I loved working with different cultures across ecosystems, across functional organizations. And so that really drove me when I came back to the US to go more into system engineering roles instead of functional engineering roles, and eventually to go back to school for an MBA. And so, after doing my MBA, that's kind of when the pivot took off to go towards internal consulting at BP, to strategy at the Boeing Company and Boeing Global Services, and then eventually to management consulting with Grant Thornton, and now with Accenture in the management consulting aerospace and defense practice. So that's a bit about my background.
And hello there, everyone. I'm Rachel McKay. I'm currently the Director of Product Development at Overwatch Imaging. So let's see, first and foremost, to get to know me, you have to know that I'm a proud mom. So I've included a picture of me and my son here, instead of my professional headshot. Now after that, you should know I'm a space nerd, and I want to be an astronaut. So we have some stuff in common there. I did my undergraduate studies in atmospheric, oceanic, and space science at the University of Michigan. It's kind of like aerospace engineering, but with some planetary science thrown in there for some extra spice. And it was during the time of Cassini and Mars Pathfinder, and my professors were all principal investigators, and so we had a front row seat for all of that excitement in space nerdery. So let's see. I was excited when right after graduation, I started at Lockheed Martin's Solar and Astrophysics Laboratory as a system engineer. So I was getting to design telescopes that would take pictures of the sun from space. And it was really exciting and really fun. I loved the work. But the adage at Lockheed at that time was that you had to be bearded, blind, or bald to be in management. And I wasn't planning on being any of those. So I started to kind of look around and see what the market was doing. It was right around the time, the tail end of the recession. And so I realized that a lot of the remote sensing work that we were doing from satellites, you could do for an order of magnitude less in cost from a UAV. And I don't know, maybe the chat can help me here, because I don't even want to say unmanned aerial vehicle, unpiloted. What's the best phrase here for our discussion? So let's see. So that was my first career pivot, was I moved out of the space science realm into more aviation and airplanes. And so what that looked like was, oh, you want to design something that has to fly through rain? Like, oh, we don't have rain in space. Like, how are you going to do that? Like, okay, I've designed for solar weather. That's kind of the same, right? Like, okay, I can figure this out. Oh, wait, you want to do salt fog testing now? Like, okay, that's new for me. Freezing fog? Like, I don't even know what that is, but okay, we can do it. And really what I did was I leveraged my system engineering background, which is to take these big, complex thoughts and ideas and chunk them down and break them down into manageable tasks so that you can really tackle them, really understand them, and figure them out. So for me, in this transition, in this pivot, going from Lockheed Martin to smaller Boeing subsidiary in situ, was there was a lot more opportunity for career advancement, because you didn't have to check the box of business process, blah, 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 blah. Do you have this many years of service? Do you have this educational requirement? You didn't have to check all those boxes. If you showed a little bit of ambition or aptitude or gumption and drive, doors were opened up for you. So I went from being a contractor when I started at In Situ to one of the highest ranking female engineers when I left the company as a senior manager. From there, I started to feel that feeling of, okay, what's next? What's the next exciting, important role? And I moved to the startup Overwatch Imaging. At Overwatch, we're designing high precision optics that go on either fixed wing or unmanned aircraft or helicopters. And we're collecting data intelligence and information. We're collecting terabytes and terabytes of data using artificial intelligence and onboard computing to process that data and give some information. And then we are providing that information, that needle in the haystack information that a decision maker needs on the ground to make decisions in real time. So I have lots of examples that I'd love to share with you. The picture that I have here in my bio, I think is pretty relevant right now because all of the West Coast is on fire. Nightly, we are flying fires. We are monitoring where the hot spots are. We are telling the firefighters where the fire line, so that in the middle of the night, we're the eyes in the skies, Overwatch, and the firefighters can get some much needed rest and come back ready the next morning, not having to assess where the fire is, but be able to like respond and put out the fires instead of having to figure out what the current status is. So that's me in a nutshell.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Lynn Strickland. What you will see up there is my full government name, Demetria. So my mom said if I ever achieved anything of great value, make sure that she uses the name that she gave me. So, good morning, everyone. So in getting to know me, you know, I have to introduce you to my favorite leading lady, which is my mom. And so she would be mortified to know that I am sharing these images of her with you guys up here to 200 some odd people. You know, but my mom was the eldest of 5 children that was raised by a single mom. And she's always had a love for education. I don't know where that came from, but she definitely instilled that in each one of her 3 children. And so, this is not original with my mom, but, she said, get as much education as you can, because once you obtain those knowledge and skills, people cannot take that away from you, And so, especially as a young woman, as a young Black woman, I think that she felt that that would serve her well. And even when she was growing up, she saw, her family struggled, with 5 children and a single mother. But her mother went back to school and became a nurse. And so although they still did struggle, the struggle was less of a struggle, having obtained that education. So she did really instill the value of education in each one of us. So, so looking at my trajectory, when I was making this out, I kind of was looking at it and I said, man, a lot of the jobs that I've had through my career were definitely tied to education, not necessarily in the format of education, of the traditional education, but coming out of the military, I'm starting to really understand apprenticeship, and not, I would say, American apprenticeship, because I did a lot of growing up in Germany as a military kid. So the apprenticeship over here is a little bit different. It wasn't anything that was planned from my perspective. But I think just having that drive and understanding education and wanting to get education and understanding, especially through apprenticeship, that there are different kinds of education that people can obtain, I think is something that stuck out for me. But one of the pivotal points, one of the transition points that I've highlighted here was the military. So after I went to college from Germany, $200 in my pocket under pain of death, that my mom said that you will finish your education before you do anything. She'll deny that she ever said that, by the way, but she did say that. I finished my college education. I got my degree in management, and I was actually bored in the jobs that I had. So I didn't list any of the management jobs that I had. But I felt myself really being bored, and I wanted something new, and I wanted a new challenge. And I don't know if that comes from having moved around a lot as a military kid and having different experiences. But I know that it was something else that I wanted to do. So at the ripe old age of 27. I went into the military, and I could have went in as an officer, and I come from a background of Air Force and Marines. So when I went into the military, into the Army, to be all that I could be, which was the logo at the time, my family was really dismayed and thought that I was making a terrible mistake, and all of these different things, but I think for me, it was a transition point because I knew that I wanted to do something different. And I think it took a lot of courage looking back, and a lot of strength that I didn't know that I had to be able to make that decision. And I spent 9 years in the military. And through that, I learned a lot of the skills that help me today with regards to leadership, with regards to team building, teamwork, problem solving, collaboration, and really being flexible with regards to where you're at in any of your careers, and just really told me that, I can do or be anything that I wanted to be. So, after getting out of the military and working with Skookum, which was a nonprofit that 75% of their workforce were people with disabilities, and getting more into apprenticeship, and then becoming a dean at, eventually a dean of instruction at Bates Technical College, that kind of set me up to be where I am today. Going into AJAC, I was a program manager, and after a few years, I became the executive director. And I love the aerospace industry. That wasn't a goal that I had set. I didn't know that I was going to wind up there, but being a part of that educational, that workforce development, is really what brought me into the aerospace industry. And I consider myself lucky to be able to, be in this industry, because it's challenging, it's changing all the time with new technology. So to become complacent in this particular industry is not something that's going to serve you well. So you really do have to be flexible with regards to that. So, people that know me know that I can talk a whole lot more, but I'll just pitch it back to Emily at this time, and we'll go forward.
Awesome. Well, we're going to launch into great conversation. A theme that kept coming up is how your skills have built on each other over time, how at the beginning of our careers, none of us really knew where our trajectory was going to go, and each different opportunity was an opportunity to build the next skill that we wanted. and certainly felt that we were maybe unprepared for that transition, but were real go-getters and wanted to get out there. Something that we continually talked about in our group was when you look at a job description, right? A woman has 99% of the skills, and it's like, I'm gonna pass. Like, I don't want to put myself out there for that. I'm not gonna get the job. And the guy looks at it, has like 30% of the skills, and he's like, I can be president. Like, let's do it, right? So want to talk about how our skills have built on each other over time, and what are some opportunities where you felt like you were unprepared for transition, and how did you overcome that? I'm going to start with Hillary.
Okay, there was not one transition I made that I didn't feel unprepared for, so let's just put that out there right now. Every single one of them was a risk in my mind, whether it was real or perceived. But I'd say, a big takeaway for me, and I don't want to flash my slide back up again, but I will say that in addition to the actual roles that I played and the places that I transitioned to, if I would have stayed in the mindset of this is the job, these are the job requirements, and this is the definition, and I stayed in that lane, I probably would have been much more narrow, and my opportunities would have been less. But I've often, I think I already said this before, if it's not a definite yes, it's a no. So you do know when to say no. But there's been a lot of definite yeses and things that I put my hand up for that were maybe outside of the framework of my real job description or maybe some extracurricular activity, but they were of great interest to me. And over time, if I look at these in an amalgamated fashion, they are the reason that I'm where I am today, because they've allowed me to pivot in a lot of ways. They've given me, in some cases, very deep knowledge in a certain area, but in other cases, a broad knowledge, which was important for my next role. And I think we talked a little bit about, I started this introduction, times when you need to make a decision to do something in your career that's maybe not the choice that you would want to make, but it's the one that you have to make. So for example, when I was in Germany, I had a 2-year assignment, got extended to 3, got extended to 4. And I have to tell you, I did not want to go home. Daniela was, kind of pinging me about it doesn't always rain in Hamburg. And no, it doesn't. It's a lovely city. But not only that, the people are amazing and my job was fabulous. And I just did not want to go back to Phoenix. But it was kind of a downturn time in the aviation industry, and I needed to come back, and they needed to put somebody else in that role or consolidate. So I went into a systems engineering role, which wasn't my first choice, but I, didn't really have an awful lot of opportunities. But I have to say, if I hadn't done that role, I would no way have gotten the next role, which was a product marketing role. And that role meant that I need to have a deep understanding of the system that I was representing from a product strategy, product placement, product development perspective. And I wouldn't have gained that without going into that. What I think I thought of at the time as a sideline role was actually the thing that put me to the next place in my career. And then 2 other times in my career, I've made personal decisions about exiting a role or exiting a company. Both times they had to do with children. I became a single parent at some point along my career. And I think that's something we don't talk about enough, that women do tend to feel the brunt of the home life, perhaps greater than the dads or the husbands or the male in the household. So I had the responsibility for my children. I was in a sales role, traveling, 50, 60, 70% of the time, had a good support network, but at some point enough is enough. And it's just not the way I wanted to live my life. So I ended up having to leave Honeywell in order to find that solace where I could have a meaningful enough career, but that I was supporting the needs of my children at the time. But if I hadn't done that, I wouldn't be in a P&L leader role now, because it put me into the program management path that gave me, that desire to move further into a, more of a VP or a P&L leader role. So, they all have benefit. I just think we have to be open to the experiences and make sure we are actively seeking the best benefit we can get out of every single role that we're in. Emily?
Awesome. Yeah, someone else who I know had a big transition, Shami, you went from engineering to consulting. I'm so fascinated by that perspective.
Absolutely. I mean, in terms of how my skills have built upon each other, I think there's really 2 main ways that they've done that. When I was in engineering, my skills went from functional engineering roles to more system and integration roles, looking at the 10,000-foot level. And that really prepared me well to transition into consulting as well. The second way that my skills built over time was also in how I solve challenges. Skills that helped me solve challenges from first the technical level, and then looking at business challenges, and then solving people and organizational challenges. And so, you know, in terms of being prepared for these transitions, right? Obviously, I had time where I went back to do another degree, and a degree doesn't prepare you, you know, fully for the roles that you're walking into. But it gives you time to kind of build up your network and your ecosystem around you to help you go through transitions in the future. And, you know, I realized in grad school, there's something they talk about as the trifecta or the triple jump in terms of making a career change. And that's changing industry, changing function, and changing geographic location. And so I see a lot of similarities here. And, you know, making all three changes at the same time is certainly very challenging, much less making one or two of them. And, you know, in making some of these big transitions, perhaps one of my biggest ones was coming out of MBA school and moving to the oil and gas industry briefly, and working as an internal consultant and working alongside other consulting firms. It was challenging. I was on the road 75% of the time. And I found that the biggest things that felt me feeling unprepared were not the things that I knew, but the things that I didn't know going into the role or the organization. And I find that that's very common, whether it's unset expectations or work culture, personalities, the history of decisions that have been made. And so, you know, in those times, I think it's really helpful to dig into those around you, ask lots of questions. When you're new, it's the biggest advantage you have in terms of asking all, you know, the so to speak, dumb questions, finding allies within the organization, and really starting to build your rapport, because it takes time to develop rapport in an organization. And that's something, you know, everyone has to go through, but especially if you change roles quite a bit. So, you know, all in all, I would say that what I found was that having a style that was true to yourself was really helpful throughout it all. You know, someone else may have been in a role prior to you, and people are used to certain ways of working. But if you bring your authentic style through, along with the strengths that you offer, you know, it takes a little time to transition, but people get used to you. And as soon as you slowly develop credibility in one thing, it builds to another and to another finally. And so those were really how I helped move through some of those transitions and what brought me to my current role with Accenture.
Awesome, thank you. This is a great conversation, and we have probably 5 to 7 minutes left. So I'm going to move on to the next question, because there's a Q&A in the chat box that I think is awesome. And if you have another question for the group, please go ahead and put it in the chat box, and we'll try to make time at the end. But Shami touched on it, and it's something that was surprising. I think I am the least educated person of our panel. I have not been to graduate school yet, and it's a huge question of the balance between when is it going to be a new skill set that you need to learn from, going to get an MBA or further education. I know Rachel has multiple degrees. And when is it something that you feel like you need in order to check the box in a promotion or a hiring process, right? Even if it doesn't necessarily stretch your learning and the job that you'll be doing. So asking the question, when did you feel that further education would provide you with the skills that you needed to advance in your career? Rachel, I would love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, my thoughts on this have actually changed as I've gone along. I hold 3 master's degrees. I started my 4th one, and I was doing that. I was trying to check those boxes and be like, oh, this application, I need to have an MBA, so I'm going to go get an MBA now. And so I did that for a lot of years. And I think that there's a cost associated with that. I think there's several costs associated with that. First, there's the obvious financial cost associated with that. Second, there's the time cost associated with that. So I think if 2020 has taught us anything this year, is that in 6 months, the world can look completely different. So if you're going to pause your dreams and your hopes and your aspirations for 2 years to go get an MBA, a ton of stuff could change in that amount of time. So that's the first thought, is if there's something that you want to be doing and a different kind of pivot in your career, go find somebody in your organization whose job you want, a person who you admire in your organization, and ask them like, hey, there's this big meeting coming up. Can I help you with that? I don't know if anybody that I've ever worked with that would say no to help for something big milestone coming up. And that's a way to get like on the job experience for yourself without having to go through and do formal education. And that's something you can do tomorrow, not wait for the 2 years to get your degree to start living the dream or the path that you want to be on.
Awesome. Lynn, I'm curious from your perspective, working with, new entrants to the workforce, what advice would you have for them about sort of challenging the narrative of needing to check every box in order to put yourself out there for a job? And I know education was critically important to your mom and she pushed you. Would love to hear your thoughts on this question.
Well, I think from my perspective, what I've learned throughout my years in working in the career and now being into apprenticeship is that, it's not always necessarily the traditional route that people need to take, right? And so, it depends on the position, whether you would need that continuing education or that advanced education or that degree. But just working in the apprenticeship mode, in the type of apprenticeship, that AJAC is, and having been in community and technical colleges and gone to school and stuff, there is really a pathway to be able to, earn a really good living and not necessarily having that degree. And I'm not advocating, don't get a degree for people and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I went through it, and I think it really is a personal perspective. So when we talk to young people, because we do youth apprenticeship, or we talk to people who are transitioning from, maybe an industry and they're interested in aerospace or they're interested, there are different pathways, and it depends on what you want to do, what kind of educational level that you're going to need. So, if you know where you want to be, you kind of have to look at really what those requirements are. And, at the appropriate time, if you need continued education or an advanced degree, you go and you try to do that. But there are other options with regards to, apprenticeship. We've had apprentices that have gone through the program who then became shop leads and then worked their way all the way up through the organization. And it's starting on the floor. They really do have a very well-rounded idea of what goes on, and what I would like to see more is more women, in industry, and not just, first of all, it is absolutely fascinating and very encouraging to see all of the women involved in aerospace and to hear all of the stories and to hear, how each one of the women have got there, and everybody's pathway has been a little bit different, but I would like to see, more women, because when I first got into industry, I was just amazed at, I guess I shouldn't say I was amazed, but it was so predominantly male and predominantly white, and so how do you encourage, young women or people of color to be able to get into industry when it doesn't exist, right? So, me out there promoting, hey, this is your opportunity. There's some great opportunities, and not just in the manufacturing section of it, but in the engineering part of it, and all of the cool stuff that Rachel's talking about, that you can do. There's so many different opportunities, but you have to understand the educational requirements to get to where you want to be. And it's not always necessarily the traditional route that people have to take to be able to get there. So, that is also encouraging, to be able to, let people know that they can have that pathway too.
Awesome, thanks. We have amazing questions in the chat box. Do we have a minute to ask a couple, or do you want to take it back over?
We can have one question.
Great.
And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to leave all you panelists in here, and so you can actually go into the Q&A and stay on afterwards. And then if you do happen to be available 12 till 1, we're going to move to a Zoom room to answer more questions, because this is just going way better than I expected, and everyone's asking questions. I want to give people more time. So
Awesome.
Yes, you can have another question.
Great. So I want to cheat and do kind of two. So Shami, one of these questions is, basically on what you said, did you feel that you had to tell people when you got into consulting that, oh, I actually come from a technical background, in order to legitimize your position within that group? And if you wouldn't mind making it short, even though that's a big question.
Sure, yeah, that's interesting. I didn't feel that I ever had to say it. I think in some ways, being in consulting, it's somewhat implied that you have some experience there, not always. I think perhaps when I changed industries for the first time, so moved into oil and gas, I felt that that was a way for me to help connect with those I spoke with. So for example, talking with folks who worked in operations and mechanical engineering, I said, oh, hey, you know, I'm an aerospace engineer and I used to work, you know, in systems engineering and thermal engineering myself too. So that helped build a bridge. But no, I wouldn't say I necessarily, you know, feel that I have to qualify myself or even get asked that question. But these days, you know, with LinkedIn and everything else, most people can pretty quickly look up your background and learn more about you. So I think that might have helped dissipate that question.
Cool. And then the question I want one person to jump on, and we could probably go longer, is tell me about a time where you either had to choose to leave your company in order to move on to the next opportunity because you had a roadblock within that pathway internally, or tell me about a time where you really fought for a promotion. Looks like Rachel's got an answer.
Yeah, I'm smirking because I think every role that I left, there wasn't a clearly defined next step for me. And I was always looking up and what's next. And my path, my thoughts are every 18 months to 2 years, you should be transitioning. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to get a new job and apply for a new job or leave your company and go somewhere else, but you should be looking to increase your responsibility every 18 months or so. And I think that helps you grow your skill set. It helps you grow your network. It helps you grow in every single way. But yeah, I think every role I've left or every company I've left is because like that next step wasn't there for me. So I had to find it elsewhere.
Awesome. Okay, Shami, Lynn, Rachel, Hillary, y'all are awesome. It's been such a pleasure to moderate this panel. Fiona, great event. I'm looking forward to listening and learning from the other incredible women that you've brought together. So thank you.
Oh, you're most welcome. You're most welcome. And actually, several of the women, including Emily, have actually been interviewed on my podcast. So you can actually hear much more from them if you head over to my website and head to podcasts. The podcast will be coming out at the end of September. So yeah, make sure you look out for an email.